Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Tyler, and the focus is presidential obstruction or doing duty. The year is 1841 and a very rocky special session of Congress has been concluded, where Congress put forward a couple of bills to establish or reestablish the Bank of the United States. Tyler had vetoed them, created ill will on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, and effectively John Tyler was kicked out of the Whig Party as the session came to an end. Well, when Congress came back just a couple of months later for its regular session beginning in December of 1841, things picked up right where they left off. The Whigs had a couple of key topics that they wanted to push forward on their agenda, and the question would be, where would John Tyler sit? These topics were regarding the sale of public lands and the distribution of those funds rather than staying in the federal treasury to go back to the states. And the other provision was an even higher protective tariff, to raise those tariff rates to help protect American industry as well as perhaps bring in more revenue into the federal coffers. Well, Tyler was worried about the national economy. Things were still reverberating in a negative fashion ever since 1837, when the panic had set in under Martin Van Buren's administration, a lot of carryover from the Jackson economic policies, and countries still running a deficit, and Tyler's concerned about going forward with provisions that would perhaps weaken the economy, and he was also really loath to increase those protective tariff rates. He was involved in the compromise measure in 1832 that set these rates when he was a member of the United States Senate, and he really didn't see a need to move above those caps. Well, negotiations going back and forth, and the one thing that Tyler eventually decided was he'll give in some in this case because the economy could use some additional revenue to help the federal government meet its expenses at least, but the Whigs in Congress were not going to be able to have their cake and eat it too. They weren't going to get the higher tariff rates and to take money from the public sales and send that back to the states. So Tyler thought that these would perhaps be offsetting and not help the national economy like was appropriate at the time. And so again, back and forth, Congress said, no, we're going to go forward with our proposal, which included both measures. So what did Tyler do? He's getting used to this now. He issued a veto, put the ball back in Congress's court. By the end of the session, they eventually caved, and they did send him a bill which coupled the suspension of the distribution of payments back to the states with the increase in the tariff rates, at least for the time being. So they got some of what they wanted, and Tyler once again used his veto to move things forward in the direction that he thought was appropriate. Well, the Whigs in Congress were at their wits' end about this with this president and his vetoes, led by Henry Clay in the Senate and John Quincy Adams in the House of Representatives. The former president, he said about Tyler at the time that Tyler is a political sectarian of the slave-driving Virginian Jeffersonian school, principled against all improvement, with all the interests and passions and vices of slavery rooted in his moral and political constitution, with talents not above mediocrity and a spirit incapable of expansion to the dimensions of the station upon which he has been cast by the hand of Providence. A biting commentary by Adams in his diary about John Tyler, not unusual because Adams had comments like this about lots of people in his diary. And in fact, Tyler would probably agree with a bunch of it, not all, but at least some of that stuff about his political point of view coming from the Jeffersonian school. That, of course, was true. The question is, what was the House or the Congress going to do about the situation? And they decided not to just sit idle. They decided to investigate it. In fact, Adams led a committee to see if maybe they had some reason to justify that Tyler as president was abusing his power in the way he was using the veto. In fact, they came out with a report that essentially concluded just that, excoriating the president over this. Tyler would have none of it. He did not concede a single point on this. He was deeply offended, in fact, by the Congress trying to intrude on his authority. He was just doing his duty. He wasn't being an obstructionist. Tyler said that the Constitution never designed that the executive should be a mere cipher. On the contrary, it denies to Congress the right to pass any law without his approval, thereby imparting to it for wise purposes an active agency in all legislation. Well, in this case, Tyler was essentially correct. There is nothing in the Constitution that says why or why shouldn't a president veto any bill coming across. The fact that the people in Congress who felt like they put him into office were upset about this did not mean that he couldn't do it. He had every constitutional right to do it. Before Andrew Jackson, it was mostly just constitutional concerns that presidents used to issue vetoes. Jackson really broke that mold. Tyler signed on to this idea that it could be for any reason, constitutional, policy differences. He had every right to issue these vetoes, and if he felt appropriate, he would continue to do just that. Well, the conflicts with the House and Senate did continue. In the Senate over some of Tyler's nominees. They were angry with him, and so they started rejecting a number of his political appointments, some more than once, because Tyler didn't want to give in. He sent Caleb Cushing to the Senate twice to be Secretary of the Treasury, rejected both times. He sent John Spencer twice forward to become a member of the Supreme Court. The Senate rejected both times. Now, certainly they didn't reject them all, but they did have their say in some of the ones that were personal to John Tyler. Then there was the question about the request for documents that came from the Congress to the executive. And now this had been debated really since the dawn of the Republic. George Washington, as the first president, was the first to issue what we now call executive privilege, denying the right to Congress to at least some of these requests for documents. Now the question is, again, what did the Constitution say? And this was the Bible as far as John Tyler was concerned. And the fact is, the Constitution is silent on this issue of whether or not Congress has the right to demand documents from the executive branch. This is an implied power that the courts over time have recognized, at least to some extent, this balance between the need for congressional oversight to include the access to documents in order to perform their legislative function. At the same time, the executive has maintained since the beginning that in certain cases they can claim this executive privilege that would release them from their obligation for a variety of reasons from providing these documents. For Tyler, he felt he had to have some say in this. There was nothing in the enumerated powers that he was violating by actually taking his own counsel on which documents he would send and which ones he wouldn't. Tyler said about executive privilege, it is intended to assert also that the executive is bound to comply with such call without the authority to exercise any discretion on its part in reference to the nature of the information required or to the interests of the country or of individuals to be affected by such compliance. Then I do feel bound in the discharge of the high duty imposed upon me to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, to declare in the most respectful manner my entire dissent from such a proposition. Now, Tyler actually did hand over documents many, many times to the Congress, but not all the time. He reserved the right not to. If he felt it was appropriate, executive privilege was hold in his mind, and he believed that was not being obstructionist. He was doing his duty consistent with his reading of the Constitution. Well, there was one other domestic situation of note during this period. There was actually a rebellion going on in the United States. It was in the state of Rhode Island. Nothing really to do with John Tyler as president of the United States directly. This was about the right to vote. Rhode Island was the only state after the United States became its own independent country not to write its own constitution for the state. All the other states wrote their own state constitutions. Rhode Island did not. It was still operating under the charter that King Charles II of England had granted in 1663. Significant property rights were required in order to gain the access to the right to vote. This was at a time when the right to vote was expanding across the country, and many Rhode Islanders were demanding change, but there was resistance from the governor and the current government of Rhode Island. So Thomas Dorr was the leader of the rebels. Governor Samuel King was the head of the official government in Rhode Island, and King again was not giving in, so Dorr called his own state constitutional convention. In fact, they held elections, and for a brief period, there were actually two governments in the state of Rhode Island. Both were adamant that they were in charge, both called out their own militia, and both appealed to the President of the United States to come in on their side. What was John Tyler to do? Well, John Tyler did what he always did. He went to the rule book. He went to the Constitution. What did the Constitution say about a situation like this? We go to Article 4, Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the state legislature or of the state executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So this appeared that Tyler had no choice. He had to go support Governor King, the existing established government in Rhode Island, not the rebels. But Tyler really meant it when he said he was going to read the Constitution literally. Tyler made the note that to protect against domestic violence meant domestic violence had to have already occurred, not just be imminent or pending. And right now it was still yet to occur. So he opted to wait. He did tell King that he would support him if the locals could not suppress the rebellion, if that rebellion actually turned violent, but it had not happened yet. And in this case, his pause, his delay, worked out for the best. Governor King actually sent in his troops, they disbanded the rebels, they restored order, and for good measure, they actually did rework things, and over the next election cycle, they did expand the right to vote actually quite considerably for Rhode Island. In this case, Tyler did not send in the military from the federal government. He was loath to do that unless he absolutely had to, and his reading of the Constitution gave him this guide not to do so, and things worked out for the best. The domestic agenda under President Tyler was effectively going nowhere. And what about foreign affairs, though? Maybe an opportunity to get something done there where Congress has less of a say. And in fact, President Tyler did have some successes in foreign policy. Those are stories, though, for another day. That is John Tyler and Presidential Obstruction or Doing Duty from the life of John Tyler. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.